This was part 2 of what I'd started last week, so they decided not to come. I began talking last week just sharing my story. And as I mentioned last week, talking about depression in a class that has to do with marriage and raising kids might not make sense, but a person who's living in depression is going to affect whatever's going on in the family very much. And so if I can help just one person to break that cycle or whatever, then all of this is worth it. So last week I shared with you about my dad a little bit. I shared with you that I'm an adult child of an alcoholic and the way that usually manifests itself within a family. I want to talk more today about depression. And I want to go back to the verse that I began with last time, which is in Psalm 13. And I'm wondering how many of you can relate to these words at some point in your life, if not right now. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes or I'll sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I've overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. And as I mentioned last week, my enemy from this passage, my enemy is my own mind, or has been my own mind. So the way this works is if you can picture a pile of sand, and you pour a lot of water on that sand, what's that water going to do? It's going to make ruts as it runs down, right? And those ruts are going to be, then if you pour more water, where's it going to go? It's going to go in the ruts. Well, our brains are a lot like that, and our brains have rut patterns in them, default settings, if you want to call it that, where we tend to go when we find ourselves in any crisis or whatever. And so for people who battle depression, our blue moods, Burns compares to, this guy's, he's an author that I'll cite quite a bit. His name is David Burns. And he compares our blue moods to scratchy music coming from a radio that's not properly tuned. And he says that we simply need to learn how to adjust the dial. Okay? And the way that he would propose that we do that, and it's been one of the best tools that I have discovered, is to be able to identify what he calls distorted thinking. The way that we talk to ourselves, the way we allow our mind to speak into us, and being able to recognize that and get out of that rut and switch gears has been huge for me in my dealing with depression. So I want to share those things with you today. We're just going to go over this list of 10 things, and this is not an inclusive list, okay? This is 10 that I kind of picked out. But these are ways that we think in a distorted way. The first one he calls all or nothing thinking. The technical name for this is dichotomous thinking, in which everything seems to be either black or white, that everything is absolute. And that kind of thinking will lead to depression because perceptions aren't going to conform to what reality is. Okay? Another one is overgeneralization. This is where we view one negative event as a never-ending pattern of defeat. Any of you ever have that problem? One negative event, well, it's just going to, it's just going to constantly be repeating itself as a pattern of defeat. I love this story Burns tells about a depressed man that he was with one day, and as they were walking to this man's car, he noticed that a bird had pooped on his windshield. And so the man said, "Just my luck. Birds are always pooping on my windshield." To which Burns said, "Tell me when the last time was that happened." He said, I can't remember. But it's just this overgeneralization that this is the way it always is. Third is a mental filter. Technical name for this is selective abstraction, which maybe you struggle with this. You allow negatives in, but you ignore positives. When people speak positively to you, they can't really mean that, but every negative thing said to you, people mean. Picking out the negative detail in any situation and dwelling on it exclusively. And depressed folks tend to wear glasses with special lenses that filter out anything positive. Let me tell you how this works in my life. And I think this is fairly true for most preachers, even those that don't suffer from depression, but it's still distorted thinking. I can preach a sermon, and afterwards, when I'm standing in the back, there can be 20 people come up and tell me, hey, I really appreciated that. And there can be one person who says something negative. What am I going to think about the rest of the day? Now, is that reality? That's distorted thinking. And we all tend toward that, but depressed people live in that. Okay? Fourth is disqualifying the positive. Insisting that any achievement that I have or any positive quality that I have doesn't count. And so something good happens and I say, that's a fluke. That's not really who I am. It doesn't count. Fifth is jumping to conclusions. Concluding things are bad without any definite evidence. And we do that in a couple of ways. We do that in mind reading, where we assume what somebody else is thinking or how they're reacting to us negatively. We make up this story in our minds. Or by fortune telling, by predicting that things are going to turn out badly. Sixth is magnification or minimization, where you blow things out of proportion or you shrink their importance. And when we magnify our imperfections and we minimize our good points, we are going to feel inferior, right? Seventh is emotional reasoning. Reasoning from how I feel. For instance, I feel like an idiot for doing that, so I must be an idiot. And it doesn't occur to challenge the validity of the perceptions that create that in us. Eighth is should statements. And I'm going to stop in just a minute and give you a chance to any feedback on any of these 10 things. But should statements. This is where we live out of should not, must nots, have nots, have tos or whatever. When our behavior falls short of this standard that we have placed on ourselves, then it creates self-loathing, it creates shame, it creates guilt. Ninth is labeling. Instead of saying, man, I made a mistake, distorted thinking says, I'm a jerk. I'm a loser. And so we take one incident and we label ourselves because of what happens in that one incident. As David Burns points out, would we think of ourselves exclusively as an eater just because we eat? Would we say, well, I'm just an eater? Would we say, I'm just a breather because we breathe air? Well, because you make a mistake doesn't make you a loser either. That shouldn't be what defines us. And then 10 is blame. This is where we assume responsibility for something that we're not entirely responsible for. I'm not talking about blaming others. This would be blaming yourself, oftentimes without mercy. So, in summary, I tried for much of my adult life to fight these demons on my own. And I do believe that's what they are. It is from the dark side. Lots of times we guilt people in depression and say that they're sinning because they don't have more faith or whatever. I think we ought to come out of a position of compassion by saying, you're held in darkness. You're a captive to the darkness. But it's only when I surrendered and realized I couldn't do it on my own. And so I sought help from God. I sought help from experts like David Burns' writings, and I sought help from a Christian counselor. And it just helped me a lot. I only had to go, 4 or 5 sessions to that counselor, but it was just like a light switch came on. Yeah, I was on some depression medication for a couple of years before that, when I was still trying to do it on my own. So my desire now is to help other people to identify this earlier. Because I was in my late 40s before I got help. So I went pretty much through the child rearing years in our family fighting this darkness in my life. And I feel like I robbed myself from a lot of my life. I have to really work hard not to live in regret about that. And so what I'm saying to you as we're talking about marriage and as we're talking about parenting, if anyone in here is fighting this darkness and fighting these demons, don't wait to deal with it. Life is too short and life is too rich to live much of your adult life in darkness. I waited till I was in my late 40s. I wish I'd done it 25 years earlier. But at the same time, I would say that even if you're older than 50, we got a couple of people in here, I guess. It's never too late, okay? It's never too late to deal with these things and to get tools in your tool belt. And that's what this identifying the distorted thinking has done for me. Don't settle for a less than emotionally healthy life. So George Everett Ross was quoted by Philip Yancey in his book, Reaching for the Invisible God. And he said this. He said, I've served in the ministry 30 years, almost 31. I've come to understand that there are 2 kinds of faith. One says if, and the other says though. One says if everything goes well, if my life is prosperous, if I'm happy, if no one I love dies, if I'm successful, then I will believe in God and say my prayers and go to the church and give what I can afford. The other says, though the cause of evil prosper, though I sweat in Gethsemane, though I must drink my cup of Calvary, nevertheless, precisely then, I will trust the Lord who made me. So Job cried out, though He slay me, yet I will trust in Him. The foundation of this healing process is a very spiritual matter because, again, we are dealing with the dark side. We're dealing with forces of darkness, which, by the way, Paul says this is who we do our battle with. It's a matter of surrender. It's a matter of letting God have control of my past as well as my present and as well as my future. And you know, through all that time, I never had any trouble preaching about and really meaning it for you. Preaching about the grace of God, preaching about the forgiveness of God, preaching about the mercy of God. And I meant it. I mean, I was sincere in preaching it to you, and yet I still struggle with appropriating that sometimes for myself. But I agree with David A. Seamands, who's the author of a book called Healing of Memories, when he says this. He says, years of experience have taught me that regardless of how much correct doctrine Christians may know, unless they have a picture and a felt sense that God is truly good and gracious, there can be no lasting spiritual victory in their lives. I believe that. All the right doctrine in the world is not going to get us there if we don't know that God is good and God is gracious.
Would you read that again?
Years of experience have taught me that regardless of how much correct doctrine Christians may know, until they have a picture and a felt sense that God is truly good and gracious, there can be no lasting spiritual victory in their lives. So we toss around these statements, and they're true statements. Statements like, God made you a unique individual. But how can you and I, how can we know that applies to us? That God made us unique individuals. Maybe when it comes to these kind of trite sayings, maybe you can relate to this guy that was served a meal on an airplane, and when he opened his dinner, there was a large roach that was sitting on top of his food. And so later he wrote a letter to the president of the airline, and in a few days he received a special delivery letter that said, "What happened to you was very unusual, but please don't worry. I want to assure you that the particular airplane has been completely fumigated. In fact, all the seats and upholstery have been ripped out. We've taken disciplinary action against the flight attendant who served you that meal, and she may even be fired. It's highly probable that this particular aircraft will be taken out of service. I can assure you that this will never happen again, and I trust you will continue to fly with us." Well, the man was really impressed that he had gotten a letter like that. But then he noticed that something was stuck to the back of this letter that he had gotten, and he found out that it was his original letter, and it had been mistakenly attached to the return letter, and there was a note that the president had written at the bottom of his letter that said, "Reply with the regular roach letter." And you know, sometimes when we hear things like, God made you a unique individual, I think sometimes we kind of think, yeah, that's just the old roach letter, you know, that's just the old standby that people say. But it's not. It is the gospel of Jesus Christ that you are special, that God holds you special. Sociologists have a theory that they call the looking glass self. And what this theory says is that we become what the most important person in our life believes us to be. Whether that's your spouse or your parent or your boss, we tend to become what the most important person in our life believes us to be. I would like to suggest that the most important individual in our life ought to be God. And God has told you what He thinks of you. And that ought to be the image into which we live. And so the end of this psalm says, verse 5, "But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for He has been good to me." Again, I've known those truths in my head for a long, long time. But only in recent years have I begun to appropriate that to my heart. Have I completely conquered it? No. No, I still find myself occasionally slipping into my rut pattern thinking, my distorted thinking. But here's the difference. I think Beverly will attest to this. Where I used to slip into the rut thinking patterns, I would stay there for days or weeks. Now, usually within an hour or two, I can catch that and reframe things because I have those tools in my tool belt. Would you agree with that?
Definitely.
So, 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 5 says, and I pray this prayer fairly regularly, "We take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ." You see, we have the ability through the Spirit to take captive every thought, including distorted thinking. Philippians 4 and verse 8, Paul advises us that whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And Romans 12:2 says that we need to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And all these verses mean to me this, that our thought patterns can be changed. And they can be challenged. And we can be healthy. So I know Beverly has some things to say, but are there any questions or any comments that come up to you as we went through those 10 distorted thinking?
What are the tools you use to avoid or to dispatch the unhealthy thought processes?
For me, Randy, I think it was just being able to recognize that that's what they are. And when I recognize that that's what they are, and I'm allowing myself to tell myself lies, it just made me realize I don't have to stay there. That's not reality. So that's the kind of the way it seemed to work for me. I don't know if that answers your question or makes sense or not, but
So identifying when you're falling into
right.
Because I think I personally have experienced all of those
Yeah.
unhealthy
Yeah.
thought patterns at one time or another.
And just being able to say, you know what? That's a distorted way of thinking. It's because I used to think that was normal thinking. And it's still easy for me to slip back into that's normal thinking. In fact, sometimes when I slip into it, Beverly will say, that's not that's not truth or something like that. And I'll sit there for the next few minutes going, yeah, it is. This is truth about me. But it just doesn't take me very long anymore to come around to the fact that it's not. So, anything else?
Rick, what did you do to make yourself start using some of these tools?
I kept it in my drawer at the office. I would look at it fairly regularly.
Is that what you mean, or do you mean how did he decide to break it?
I mean, just whenever obviously you have some kind of self-awareness that, oh, wait a minute, I'm kind of
Just
going
start
back
back.
into this. And so I was just wondering what you did to try to ride the track, so to speak, to get yourself,
Well, like I said, I got help. I have a wife who I have given permission to remind me when I slip into distorted thinking. I keep that list of 10 things in my desk drawer, and I used to read over them a lot. I don't have to as much anymore because it's now become more of my thought process. But I think just keeping that in front of you till you get used to it is helpful. Does that answer your question?
yeah, so just more of a self-awareness, self-reflection.
Mm-hmm.
Take a few minutes and think about it.
That's right. Yep.
Did going to the counseling sessions just help you understand, like, oh, this makes sense now, or like talking through what had happened to you or whatever, like you were able to place, like,
Yeah.
oh, that explains why I react that way, but then, like you started, you're not a victim in that, and then you steer your, you know what I mean, like,
Yes.
was it through that helping you?
She helped me to be able to see what my family of origin was like, which was a real eye-opener to me. Somehow, and these folks are good. I mean, Beverly could do this, very quickly. But they are able to identify what were those negative things in your family that she had me do a little bit of role play where I'd actually talk to my older brother and things like that. And it just didn't take long. Of course, I told y'all last week, she told me, I want you this next week to go get a kite and go out and fly a kite because, I never had a childhood. And she was just trying to get me to tap into my inner child. I can't remember if she's the one that put me on David Burns or not.
She is.
That was the biggest thing. David Burns' book, I don't like the title of it. He has this workbook. The book is called Feeling Good, okay? But the workbook is what helped me the most, and it's called 10 Days to a Healthy Self-Esteem. And it talks a lot about this distorted thinking. And it just helps you be able to process it over a 10-day period. That was the most helpful thing that I discovered in my counseling.
So dealing with medical issues personally, I've had a lot of people that have contacted me and said, hey, I've got some family or myself that's dealing with the same thing. What can I do for that person to kind of help out? And one of my pieces of advice is, and you're going to hear it from everybody in the world saying, I'm sorry. And that's perfectly fine because sympathy is wonderful. But at some point you're going, you know what, thanks, I appreciate it. But there's a breath of fresh air when something else comes up. We're going to fight this thing. We're going to go after this. But in a sense of somebody who's within your network that's dealing with distorted thinking, from another party's perspective, I mean, what are the positives to kind of help reinforce a better way of thinking or to help get over that obstacle of distorted thinking? I mean, if you've got any off the top of your head.
That's a good question. I'm not real sure how to adequately answer it, though.
That's sort of where I'm going.
Oh, okay.
I mean, if you want to
Okay.
answer from your personal, but then I want to give some global.
I don't know how many people I've put on the David Burns stuff, and it's been very helpful to them. I encourage them to go to counseling. So much of this is stuff we're just not going to be very successful if we try to do it ourselves. We need someone from the outside to be able to guide us through it. And you can have a victory over this. I think you don't have to live this way. I didn't, for a long time, I didn't know I had a choice. You know, you don't have to live this way. It's a self-imposed prison.
I think for me, my depression is kind of intermittent and cyclical in my life. So when stressors, I know that's a big trigger for me, and then I'll kind of dip low. But once you learn kind of what your triggers are, I think it's a lot easier to be able to identify. So for me, if I get super stressed or something, working out or elevating my heart rate to get my endorphins going, and Carl will notice if I'm like kind of low and then I go to the gym. I'm like a new person. And so too, asking how to help somebody. For a long time, I would just get mad. And the easiest person to get mad at is my spouse because he's my closest. I can be mean to him because I'm feeling whatever, lonely or insecure. So for a long time, it would make him mad that I was mad. But then he started saying, are you having a hard day? Meaning like emotional. And that to me was just, it wasn't like, oh, you're being awful, oh, you're being mean. It was his way of like, how can I help you?
That's great.
It opened up a lot.
Yeah. So what do you have to share?
Well, I think depression, we use that term so loosely, and I want to identify that what Rick was struggling with is called chronic depression. He did not get out of it. For that beginning season, he didn't have necessarily good and bad. It was a way of life for him. It was a way of thought for him. Some of us have more situational depression, where a grief happens that is unchecked, and I'll talk about that in just a second, but it's where it's more a moment of darkness. It may last a few days, but if you're like me, I identify with those 10 things, and gut level truth, I've never struggled with depression. It's not my deal. Now, I can come across an anxiety, which I think those are first cousins, but they're not the same. But chronic and situational are different. Lauren brought out a beautiful point. Sometimes I think we get this image in our mind that depression is chronic sadness. On some depressed people, it does not look like sadness. It looks like anger. It looks like triggering rage. And therefore, it is difficult, and the research bears out, it is hard to live with someone who's in that state. It's a hard marriage, it's a hard parenting role, because depression takes over a household. Bottom line, I didn't tell you this last night, and I tried to tell you everything I was going to say before, but I think I've told you this in private enough. When I walk in the house, I can feel it, even if he's not in the room with me, if he's struggling with depression. It is a palpable feel in our home when there's the struggle. Is that you fair? Okay. We can feel that. There is a book for male depression that's called I Don't Want to Talk About It. That's the title of the book by Terry Real. I don't want to talk about it. Because men don't always want to address this. And I'm not sure if that's just men. I think women struggle with that too in today's world. Chronic, situational, things to do. You said something kind of briefly, but this is before things to do. I'm going to go back to this. For a long time in Christian world, we talk like depression was sin. I think there's a fine line there. I don't believe that pain from childhood is a sin. Let me say this in another way, and I think you'll get it. People frequently say to me in grief, "You are so strong. You are so brave." And I go, whoa, 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 whoa. I mean, I don't say this out loud. This is what's going on in my mind. How is it strong or brave because I buried someone that I love? I didn't have a choice about that at all. That is not strong, and that is not brave. I just did something I had to do. What's strong and what's brave is to do the work to learn to carry it. So it's not strong and brave just to be depressed. It is hard. I've watched him struggle with how to do it better. And I think all of us do at some level how to do it better. How to wire up when, the Bible addresses transform your mind, think on these things, take charge of. Just because you think something once doesn't mean you have to keep that thought. It means you argue with that thought. It means you reclaim that thought. Neurotransmitters in our brain learn very early in life which neurotransmitters they want to link with. And frequently, this isn't bloodline. Personally, I don't know anybody that knows if depression is from blood or environment. I personally think it's a little bit of both. Meaning, because your mama was depressed, does that mean you're depressed? Maybe it may mean you have a heightened propensity for it, absolutely. But also, it's in the environment. When you learn that feel of walking in, this is what people live like, it's environmental frequently. Are you tracking with that? Does that make sense? And so what we've got to do is learn, just because those neurotransmitters fire up from childhood, doesn't mean they can't be broken. They're not broken by pretending or even simply talk. We've got to really challenge those. And what was in the David Burns book, I don't believe that book is about self-esteem. I think it's about self-compassion. And I don't think it has to be done in 10 days. But what it gives you a lot of are speech bubbles. I say this to me, this is the truth. I say this to me, this is the truth. David Burns is a psychiatrist. But he believes that depression can be taken care of through learning to talk differently to you. He said it doesn't require a medication. Now, Rick, we didn't know about it when he went on the medicine. And really and true, I'm the one who called the doctor and said, I need help. It was a friend of ours. I said, I don't know what you're going to give him, but this is hard. And Perry ended up prescribing something miles away and saying, I've seen it, I know it, this is what's going to help. This is at least a jump starter. Bipolar, according to psychiatrists, according to Dr. Burns, is the only mental health condition that absolutely requires a medication. That I'm not opposed to a depressed person getting on a med, but some people are resistant, so they think if I don't want to get on a med, I'm not doing anything, and that's not okay. You've got to do the hard work. This is not waking up in the morning and life is normal. This is hard. Even if for us as women, it's a once a month event, you figure it out. You know the calendar. You learn to eat differently. You learn to keep your mouth closed. You learn to sit with it so we're not hurting people. Things to do. I always recommend
Let me say something real
Go
quick
for
there.
it.
I was on this medication for several years, and I think I saw it more as looking back, I think it was more of a crutch to me than anything. I expected that to be what was going to do the work for me. And I'll be honest, it really didn't. And I'm not sure that I saw any change really in my life as a result of that. I'm not telling you not to, if a doctor says you need some medication to take it, but it wasn't until I got more proactive in working some stuff out in my own life, and I haven't been on the medication for ever since then. So I agree with David Burns. So anyway, that's what.
Thank you. No, I'm
yeah.
grateful. I'm grateful. Things to do. If you are struggling with depression, I think you've got to go to the doctor. There are too many medical illnesses that can mask as depression, thyroid issues, etc. You've got to go to a doctor. You've got to get checked out. Tell them, I'm struggling with some chronic sad thoughts. Let's figure this out. Once you're clear. There is an old saying that depressed people can't sleep. Now with the research is bearing down on pretty hard as people who don't sleep become depressed. And that means you do whatever it takes to get enough rest. Lots of research being done right now that Americans as a whole are not getting enough sleep. That doesn't mean excessive sleep, because depressed people can sleep excessively. It's figure out what's a healthy amount for you. Get off your phone. Get off blue light totally. And rest. Get rest. Also, a natural antidepressant is exercise. Exercise. It supplies serotonin, norepinephrine. Getting our bodies moving. My grandmother didn't have to exercise because, my goodness, she had a garden. She exercised all day long. This is a new American problem. This is new America. We've got to figure out how to do some things a different way. Also, there's certain foods that can make you feel dark clouded. I'm going to throw it in right here because I don't know if I'm going to get finished, but alcohol is a depressant. If you're struggling, and having a drink may make you feel better momentarily, having two may make you feel really good, don't do it. Figure it out. Alcohol is a depressant. Know in advance how many you're going to have. Which I'm a proponent of knowing in advance you're only going to have one. But it can make you feel very dark. There is a book. I like the book. It's easy to read, but it's built on a stop sign. It's called Stop, Breathe, Believe. And what this author says, Diane Jones, she says, just stop periodically throughout the day. Just stop. Every 15 minutes if this is new for you. Every 10 minutes if this is new. Stop. If you're driving and when you come to a red light, let that be a time. Just stop. And figure out, what am I thinking right now? And is this a good thing to be thinking? Is this what I want to be thinking? Because it's not the big thoughts that hurt us, it's the random thoughts that hurt us. When you're in a depressed mode, you're in mode. I mean, it is going faster. If I asked Rick, what are you thinking about? When he was sad, he's like, I don't know. You need to know. Stop. Get some breaths. And then when you get to the green, so stop is red, breathe is yellow, and then the green is choose a truth. What do you believe is a higher truth? She calls them, and I love this, believements. What's your believement? What do you believe is a good truth? And don't use the one ineffective. It's all going to be okay. That's ineffective. Just go for something else. Give yourself permission to feel whatever you feel. Negative emotions are not, I'm even using that. Hard emotions are not negative or bad. They're part of it. And some people equate grief and depression. They have the same look. They can look the same on you. A lot of tears. But grief and depression are not the same. Grief is normal. Grief is natural. Grief is from the Lord. We grieve what we lost that we love. Depression is not. But grief, I knew this even going into grief. If I didn't do it well, I was going to get depressed. People who've been through a hard divorce, you don't work it, you're going to end up depressed. People struggling with infertility, miscarriage, death, if you don't do it well, you're going to end up depressed. Doing it well just means giving yourself permission to feel, having someone that you talk to, not numbing the pain. Giving yourself permission to talk about it. Giving yourself permission to invite someone into it. Tell somebody that you know will pray. Yeah. And will pray out loud where you hear them over you, because it is a spiritual battle. It is a spiritual battle. One of the natural antidepressants, and I've talked about this a lot in here, and I'm probably not done doing it because I'm going to do it a lot when we do parenting, and it's gratitude. Doesn't mean you have to feel gratitude. You just need to start speaking gratitude. You need to start writing gratitude. I'm grateful for it, because you can't be in that depressed state and feel gratitude. And that's kind of moving into a new place in your brain, moving into some neurotransmitters. Number one, for us as Christians, and I saved this for the last, please, 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 please don't shame. Don't make people feel inferior as a believer or less as a Christian because they're in depression. They need us to journey beside them. They need somebody that will say, I'm with you. You write me if you struggle. Sometimes we need an older person that will replace the lack of positives we got from our own birth parents. We need somebody to look at us and say, you have a really good heart. You are a good person. You are a good man. You're a good woman. And when it's hard to say them to ourselves, but we believe that because God made us, we have goodness. And then we learn to challenge those 10 thoughts, and when we talk back to them and they're not in the loop. Stop. Breathe. Claim your believement. Claim your believement. What we as a church need to do is just show up and listen to each other, and it may be more than we can do at church on Sunday morning. It may mean getting involved in each other's lives. We listen, we go for walks together, we show up, we hear. So, if you got a thought or a question, too bad, so sad, class is over. Sorry. If you have a thought or question, you know where we'll be at after church. We want to be with you. Let me just speak this to you as we close. I'm super, super proud of you. I'm proud that you were brave enough to give voice to this. I think a lot of people are very helped when you do. And I believe that what you've done the last 2 weeks in here, I haven't been able to listen to last week's yet, it's not up, but what you've done is I believe the Spirit has used you to use bolt cutters and to cut some chains of bondage that have held people, and you've offered words of hope through your own testimony and your own story.
That is so my desire.
Believe it. I believe that's happened. So.
Hey, let's pray. Father, thank you for who you say we are, and may we really believe it. And I am grateful if even one person or a couple of people in here have been given some tools or given some kind of motivation to deal with this darkness of depression. Lord, we're grateful that we and you are conquerors. And so I'm just praying that your Spirit will work in this room and through this place, that we can live the abundant life that Jesus has promised us, that He's called us to. Thank you so much, God. Thank you so much for your Spirit who lives in us. Thank you for family who surrounds us and walks with us. And thank you for this time this morning that we can worship together. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.